Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Common Sense with Dr. Ben Carson. I'm your host, Ben Carson, and today we're diving into the intersection of faith, education, and leadership. And I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Paul Maurer, who is the president of Montreat College, a distinguished Christian liberal arts institution. We'll explore how Christian education can equip young people for cultural engagement, moral leadership, and a meaningful life in today's challenging world. Dr. Maurer is a scholar of the American presidency and teaches American constitutional history. So we really can't wait to dive into his thoughts ahead of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Dr. Maurer, we're honored to have you here. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carson. It's an honor to be with you.
Well, for our audience who are not familiar with Montreat, can you tell us a little bit about the college?
We're located outside of Asheville, North Carolina, about 20 minutes outside of Asheville in western North Carolina in the mountains. We're a 109-year-old institution. Probably the folks who are most well-known that have been connected to the college over 80 plus years has been the Bell and the Graham families. Montreat, North Carolina was home to Billy and Ruth Graham. Before that, Ruth Bell Graham moved here with her missionary father. He had served as a medical missionary outside of Shanghai, China for over 2 decades. And when they were exiled back in the mid-1930s, they settled here in Montreat, and Ruth and Billy met at Wheaton College and got married. And when he began to travel as a preacher, she said, let's get back to where my parents live. And so they moved here back in the early 1940s. They were married in our chapel here on campus, known as Graham Chapel. And so we have been a 2-year college along the way. We were a 4-year women's college along the way, and we became a full baccalaureate and master's degree granting institution back in the mid-90s, and that kind of sealed the current identity of who we are. We are a distinctly faith-based institution. A lot of schools started as faith-based institutions and then walked away from that.
Including Harvard and Yale.
Including every Ivy League school except Cornell.
Yeah.
Which proudly thinks of itself as infidel Cornell, or so I hear. And so we have actually just doubled down on that and said there's no reason for us to change, because we think not only the liberal arts is a great way to educate human beings, but to acknowledge that there's a sovereign God and to walk in grace and humility in submission to God. We think that combination of understanding God's goodness and God's supremacy and sovereignty, as well as the liberal arts, we think that Christian liberal arts is the best education available to humanity.
Amen. Well, before you came on board in Montreat, they were experiencing severe financial difficulties, and particularly from 2011, 2014, enrollment dropped significantly. There was even talk of closure of the school. Why would you take on a situation like that?
That's a really good question. I said no twice. I said to the headhunter, I'm a rational man, and a rational man does not take the presidency at Montreat College. Thank you for the call. Goodbye. And the second time he called, he said, the search committee really wants you to reconsider. And I had another hour of phone conversation. I said, Bill, I'm not running toward this. I'm running away. I'm running away as fast as I can. And he said, would you be willing to fly down just for a casual conversation with the search committee? I walked in the door, and what they hadn't told me is they had named me a finalist, and I was the first of 5 finalists to be interviewed that week. On Friday morning, he called me and said, I've got some news for you. The search committee took a blind first ballot vote, and you were number 1 on all 12 ballots. And I said, Bill, that's very bad news, because I have no interest in Montreat College. And so my wife at that point as we kind of digested that information, my wife said, maybe the Lord's in this. Maybe we need to actually consider this. And I looked at her and I said, please don't tell me that. Don't go there, because I don't want to go to Montreat. So in the end, we came as an act of obedience. We felt like God was leading us to this place. And
You didn't have to go through the whole Jonah experience.
It was very much of a Jonah experience.
Well, you've obviously done some pretty amazing things. What were the biggest challenges that you faced during the first year?
Well, the most important challenge we faced right away was identity. We had been a faith-based college, but we had drifted a bit along the way. The statement of faith had gotten changed a bit. We weren't hiring to a statement of faith standard. I do have a Master of Divinity, so I have the advantage of having a theological education. And I said to the search committee, even before I came in the door, I said, I'd like to suggest that we can strengthen the statement of faith and we can strengthen hiring practices. And so we went through a very lengthy, very transparent, open process. And we took it slow because we knew it was a major cultural shift. And over about a 2-year period, we rewrote the core documents of the institution, and then we made that statement of faith and a community life covenant outlining kind of just some real basic do's and don'ts that Jesus and Paul teach in Scripture. We made those conditions of employment. And when we did so, we took a lot of heat, and then the heat went away, and we began to build a culture. And so the most important thing we've done is clarify our identity as a Christ-centered institution. And the most important job I have is building culture. So I pay very close attention to that.
And in that covenant that you created, it wasn't a radical covenant at all. It was things like the Bible is the infallible word of God, that the sanctity of marriage is defined as between a man and a woman, one each, chastity among the unmarried, and the dignity of life from the womb to the tomb. None of those seem like radical things to me. But there were some people who even wanted to push back on those. Were they not? How did you deal with the pushback?
Well, because we did the process slowly, we gave people a chance to self-select. If you're not a fit, maybe in the next year or two you could find a place that's a better fit. And so we never had a bloody Thursday. When we implemented this in 2017, if people were able to affirm and support those documents as a condition of employment, we took them at their word. There was no witch hunt. There was no looking over shoulders. We didn't question anybody. We just said, this is an act of conscience, and if you can affirm and support these documents, then we'd love to have you. And we knew that some people would do that as a convenience because they didn't want to leave or change their jobs. And over the next few years, those folks that we think probably did it for convenience, they eventually self-selected. And that's how, over time, the culture became a really vibrant, healthy culture.
Well, what kind of leadership culture did you try to instill in your administrative staff and your faculty?
Well, I had the advantage of having a presidency before coming to Montreat, and I learned some pretty painful lessons, mostly that I had not connected the dots as a Christian leader of a Christian institution with biblical values. And what I mean by that is that, I'm a driven, ambitious, intense doer. I like checking the box and getting stuff done. I like achievements. And so in my first presidency, I defaulted to that. But that's really not Jesus' teaching on leadership. And so what is? And servanthood and humility and building trust and valuing the relationships are actually ahead of getting stuff done. And so I had to learn that lesson, and I did. It was painful to learn it. And so when I came here at my first all-employee meeting and every all-employee meeting since, I tell the story of how I came to this suite of values that begins with humility, that is followed by building trust, that prioritizes the primacy of relationships ahead of effectiveness. We have to be effective. We have to have a sense of urgency. We have to be really committed to achieving at a high level. But if we prioritize humility and trust in relationships ahead of those things, then hopefully the way we do them will change and matters. And so I say it out loud to my community because I need to be held accountable to it, because my
Right.
default is not humility. My default is getting stuff done. And
Well,
so I'm held accountable by my community by saying it out loud.
well, as it says in Proverbs 22:4, by humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. Very good example of that you just displayed. Now, you mentioned earlier that all the Ivy League schools, except Cornell, had started out as Bible colleges, places where you were going to create men of the cloth. What do you think it is that makes them drift so far away, almost to the complete opposite?
Well, I think most of American higher education has gone through a pretty slow moving journey. Anthony Kronman, the former dean of the Yale Law School, wrote a book back in 2007 called Education's End: Why Colleges and Universities Have Given Up on the Meaning of Life. Kronman is not a professing Christian. He's a secular humanist by self-identification. And he basically divides all of American higher education into three categories, time periods. The first is what he calls the Age of Piety, from the founding of Harvard in 1636 to about the Civil War. The next era, from the Civil War to about the 1960s, he calls the Age of Secular Humanism.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Age of Piety slowly and gradually and fully and finally disappeared, with the exception of a few of us left in the marketplace, and it was replaced by secular humanism. And Kronman argues that secular humanism is an alternate way of teaching the meaning of life. But then the third section, since the 1960s to today, which he does not name overtly, but he describes nihilism. He describes the concept that there are no values, there's no right or wrong, that the faculty at universities no longer have any credibility or voice on teaching any version of the meaning of life. And so what I think has overtaken most of American higher education is a culture of nihilism. And I think when you have nothing, because we are innately spiritual beings, some form of morality will always try to fill the void. And so I think cancel culture is a form of a moral compass that has no redemptive qualities to it, but we're seeing people grasping for something, and it generally turns out very badly.
You also had to deal in your early years with COVID and Hurricane Helen. How did you get through all that? What gave you the strength to get through that?
Well, in the end, I know that Montreat College is not mine. It's the Lord's. It's not my college. I'm a steward. And so my job is to steward a miracle. This college should have closed. As you mentioned, it went through very difficult times. It should have closed many times over many decades, actually, because the school has been small and the economics have been strained. And so I think that perspective, that I'm just a steward, it doesn't mean I work any less hard, but it also centers me on what the reality is of who this institution is and who it reports to. But secondly is you learn to do emergency management by doing emergency management. And if you've been a leader of anything over any period of time, you learn most of the really valuable things you learn by the school of hard knocks. You learn by emergency or by crisis, and you learn how to deal with it or you don't. And people who are in leadership for a long time tend to have gone through a number of those, and I've been through a lot of those over the years.
Yeah, sometimes we have to look at the negative factors as strengthening. I was just talking to somebody this morning who had received a presidential pardon for something that he didn't do anyway in the first place, but he wouldn't take a plea deal because he said, I can't plead guilty to something I didn't do. But he was telling me how much closer to God he has been since that episode, since actually spending time in prison. And sometimes that happens in our lives. Dr. Maurer, we talked about the precarious position that the college was in when you started and you took on the role of president. Can you walk us through some of the structural and academic reforms that you introduced that were really the keys to the college's recovery?
Yeah, thank you. In addition to clarifying our identity, we knew that we had to get serious academically in a way that the college really hadn't been serious academically. In other words, it's not enough to be a Christian college. You've got to be a Christian college that actually cares about academics. Because these are higher education, for better or for worse, is largely seen as a commodity, and that includes the Christian community. But if you're going to claim to be something, you've got to do it really, really well. So we began to look at our programs. I had to hire an executive team when I started at the college in 2014. I had 5 open cabinet positions. And that's really good because I get a chance to choose my own team right away. But it's really, you're pedaling pretty fast early on because you've got a group of interims. And so I worked a lot of hours, didn't get a lot of sleep those first few years, and we began to build programs. My first year was the first year the college had a bachelor's of science in cybersecurity. And I didn't know anything about cybersecurity when I walked in the door. And a year in, I looked around my leadership team and I went, I'm reading about cybersecurity 3 or 4 days a week on the front page of the New York Times. Maybe we've got something here.
Hmm.
So we made the decision in late 2015 to kind of swing for the fences on cybersecurity. And I'd known for a long time that if you're going to be president of a small college, it's a really good idea to find a niche, something that you can be better at than anybody or almost anybody, and you become known for that. And it gets to the principle that a rising tide lifts all boats.
Right.
And so if you can raise the water level, all the boats are going to go up. And part of the way to do that is through a distinctive academic program.
Hmm.
We chose cybersecurity, and we began to invest heavily in terms of time and resources, and it began to grow. And so over the years now, we have emerged as a national leader. We're around the table with a national security agency working on the future of American higher education cybersecurity workforce. We've developed a statewide workforce development project in a partnership with Fayetteville Technical Community College in the eastern end of our state. We've helped the White House write their cyber strategy. We did that under the Biden administration. We were just back at the White House a few weeks ago in this new administration to say we're happy to help. We've done this work before. We're happy to assist if we can be of assistance. And so cyber's become a very substantial program for us. And part of the value proposition is that we do it differently than state U or secular U because we have ethics and character built into every element of how we do it. And so
Yeah, that was one of my questions for you. How do you build, how do you integrate ethical considerations into cybersecurity education?
Well, most people understand pretty quickly that if you're going to have a cybersecurity professional on your team or at your bank or protecting your health data, you've got to trust them. So our value proposition early on that we tested pretty extensively was this, that the problem of cybersecurity is not principally a technical problem. It's principally a human problem. And therefore, the solution to cybersecurity is not principally a technical solution. It's principally a human solution. If you don't have people of ethics and character as your cyber leaders and operators, your technology doesn't matter very much. So we don't think AI is going to solve the cyber problem. It can be part of the solution, but if you don't have ethical, trusted human beings acting in ethical ways that reflect character, things will go very, very badly. And we're already way behind the bad guys, and so we need an ethical workforce built to take on the bad guys.
Well, that must have been sort of an inspiration from God. That was a great thing because, Montreat has become very well known in that particular area. And I think that probably has a lot to do with the college's recovery. So congratulations for recognizing that and doing something about it.
An inspiration from the Lord.
Amen. Now, what is your view of the importance of Christian higher education, especially in a country that's become progressively more secular?
Well, I am a Christian, so I do have a biased opinion about this. And as we've watched the public problems that Ivy League campuses have faced in dealing with anti-Semitism, it's become very public, and people, I think, largely see that the wheels have kind of come off of American higher education in a lot of ways. And so, one of the kind of recent narratives that I've taken on is that you can be an elite institution, or you can be a very, very wealthy institution, or you can be both, but it doesn't mean that you're great. And so I think a lot of people no longer believe that the wealthiest and elite institutions of our nation are great. And so I think that the Christian institutions of our country have the ability to fill a gap. And I think to some degree already are, but they're not known, and they're not wealthy, and they're not elite. But I think if you're defining greatness biblically, I think the greatest institutions in the country today in higher education are distinctly and unapologetically faith-based institutions.
Do you think there's something that's going on with the younger generation? You remember the revivals at some of the colleges, Berea and places like that have taken place. It seems like it's more than just a coincidence that this is happening.
Yeah, I think I don't know what's going on, but whatever's happening is fascinating. Uh, we are seeing something happening. Uh, Justin Brierley wrote the book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, and so I've been listening to his podcast, Unbelievable, for a while now, and you've got all these public atheist intellectuals who are walking away from the emptiness of secular humanism and of atheism. And so I don't know what's happening, but I think the emptiness of naturalism and atheism has people are seeing that our culture is in deep, deep trouble. And you've got people like Barry Weiss, who started the Free Press, having left the New York Times, who's an atheist, who's asking the question, do we need a religious revival, a Christian revival in the United States? Well, I don't remember any time in my lifetime when atheists were asking those sorts of questions, but they are now. So something is going on, and I don't know how to term it or predict it, but something is happening.
Well, when students come to Montreat um, and they take biology, for instance, uh, are they taught both sides of the story,
They are.
creationists and evolution?
They are, because we're committed to teaching critical thinking and helping students actually understand the scope of what's out there, and they make their choices. We don't indoctrinate our students. We teach them and we educate them how to think and how to think critically.
And speaking of indoctrination, in 1963, Congressman Herlong of Florida read into the congressional record the 45 goals of communism in America, and they included gaining control of the educational system, of teacher unions, of university newspapers, of a whole host of things to indoctrinate our young people. Do you think that maybe some of the things that are going on in our country are intentional by people who recognize that they can't take us down militarily, but they can certainly erode our morals and our values and destroy us from within?
It's a great question. It's a question I've thought a lot about. I've listened to people speak on it and opine about it. And there sure is evidence to suggest that, yes, there's at least some of that going on. Who's doing it? Where is it happening? I don't know answers to any of those details, but it seems a little perhaps too coincidental to suggest that none of that's happening. But again, I'm not a I'm not a conspiracy follower or conspiracy theorist or thinker, but you just look around at the evidence and you go, uh, we know there are a lot of bad people in the world, and we know they do things in the shadows and in the dark, and universities are ripe for this sort of thing. And we look at what's happened, and so surely some version of that has taken place.
At the American Cornerstone Institute, which I head up, our four cornerstone principles are faith, liberty, community, and life. And we have a pediatric component called Little Patriots, where we try to teach the young people the principles behind the establishment of our country and the real history of our country, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But if you're objective, there's a heck of a lot more good than there is bad and ugly. And you have so many people who seize upon the bad and the ugly, and they try to build everything around that and say, therefore, we're an evil country because we had slavery or something like that. Without having a global understanding of mankind's history, you might accept that. Mm-hmm. But if you have that global understanding, you realize that virtually every society has dealt with slavery. And the thing that makes us unique is not having slavery, but having had so many people who were opposed to it so vehemently that we fought a bloody civil war and lost a large portion of our population to get rid of it. And, people who don't know history are very easy targets. How are you finding students who are coming into college these days in terms of their knowledge of who we actually are as a country?
Well, I think the knowledge base is actually quite low. I think the awareness level is quite low. The course that I teach on American constitutionalism, they're blank slates. It's tabula rasa. And so it makes what we do all the more important because we are creating foundations of actual information about America's founding because they come in without much foundation at all. And so to the degree that there's a poisonous narrative at many of the universities, which there clearly is, about America and about America's founding, and does not take into the account world history or the brilliance of our Constitution and how well it's worked for most of our history, we're pushing up against a pretty challenging situation.
Absolutely. Well, what gives you hope? You interact, you see these students all the time. What gives you hope about the next generation of Christian leaders?
Yeah, what gives me hope is that I do think Gen Z cares very much about purpose and meaning. They want hope. They want meaning for their lives, and that posture generationally, I think gives me a lot of hope. I think you add to that the places like Montreat College that are educating the next generation of Christian leaders. It's good soil. It's fertile soil. And so we have a front row seat here to see boys turn into men and girls turn into women. And they leave here. We just had commencement a couple weeks ago. So it's my favorite day of the year.
It is fun, isn't it?
It's so great because it's why we exist. We exist to educate them and then to send them. And so if you never know who the next great leader will be in some segment of society.
Absolutely.
You educate them and you send them, and we get the privilege of doing that.
Well, what message would you share with parents who are scratching their heads right now and considering a Christian college for their child?
I would suggest that the Christian colleges as a whole are the finest institutions of higher learning left in the United States. And if you don't have at least one Christian college as a finalist for what you're looking at, I think you're missing a potentially life-changing opportunity for your sons and daughters. The other thing I would say very quickly is that at any age, but when a person's between the ages of 18 and 22, they're really making a lot of life decisions, and they're making decisions for the first time. They haven't really made a lot of decisions
Mm-hmm.
up until college. And so culture matters. Where that education happens really does matter. And D1 football doesn't matter, and big, fancy, beautiful buildings don't matter, but the faculty does, and the culture and the environment of that campus culture really does. And so I don't think there's anything more important in the college decision than fit, cultural fit. You can get a good academic education in a lot of places. You can't get a good human development experience at a lot of places, but you can at our schools.
And what word would you give to young people today who are trying to remain grounded in faith, but to become successful in a secular society?
Stay connected to God every day. Nurture your heart. Our hearts can get cold. Our propensity for sinfulness and straying always is always lurking. And so our ability to nurture our relationship with God and really lean into his grace and mercy is absolutely foremost. But after that, it really matters who you choose as your friends. You know, the old expression, you're the average of your 5 closest friends, I think is really true. And so how well we choose our friends really matters. And that all of that plays into culture, and the kind of person you want to be will be shaped by who you spend your time with and what you prioritize.
Well, along those same lines, what do you think is happening to American families? We're in a situation where, for instance, in the 60s, the average births per woman was 3.6. Today, it's 1.6. We have the rise of the dinks, double income, no kids. We have fewer people getting married, a lot more divorces. What what do you think is happening to us, and what is the solution in your opinion? Or is there a solution, or is this just the downward migration of mankind?
Well, from the very beginning, our American founders called us an experiment. And I think that we are still an experiment. And I do think uh, it's hard to narrate anything other than that our culture is in decline. We are in decline as a country, and that's hard for me to say as a person who sees the glasses half full and an optimist and a believer in the redemptive work of Christ for all who receive him. I do think that there are different cultures simultaneously existing in our United States nation. And I think we're seeing a rise in homeschooling. We're seeing a rise, the
Tremendous.
Christian K through 12s are bursting at the seams. The public confidence in public education is declining. The wheels have come off of many of those institutions as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think people are acting in a way that new wineskins are being created. So we're in a time of immense disruption, and I don't know at a global level in our country how things will turn around other than some sort of a great awakening or great revival. But I think the people who believe in God are taking steps to create a healthy family environment and culture for their sons and daughters to grow up in a healthy way.
Well, as a historian, you're aware of the situations that existed before the two great awakenings.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we're ready. And I think Montreat can play a big role in that. What are your future plans for the college? Number one. And number two, if people want to find out more about your college, students who are interested and parents who are interested, is there a website they can go to?
Yeah. We're in the relentless pursuit of greatness, biblical greatness as a college. And we've had record enrollment here 9 of the last 10 years. Looks like we'll have the largest freshman class in the history of the college this fall. We had the largest freshman class in history this past year. We're clearly on target to break that record for this coming fall. And I think what that tells us is that there really is a hunger and a desire for places like Montreat College.
Right.
And so we pursue greatness, biblical greatness. We want students' lives transformed, and that happens here. If you want to know more, you can go to our website. Montreat is it's not Montreat, it's not French, it's Mountain Retreat. It's an amalgam. And so montreat.edu. And we would love to have you come visit and know more about us.
Well, I want to thank you for what you've done. You've shown what is possible when you put God first and you have a value system that includes hard work and dedication. And that should be an example for all of us. And I hope a lot of young people out there will take another look if they haven't looked at Montreat already. And because they are our future. And we're at the precipice right now of what kind of country we're going to become.
Mm-hmm.
Are we going to go down the same road that others have gone down when they reach the 250-year mark? Or are we going to accelerate? We got to make that decision. And colleges like Montreat are an important part of that. And I want to thank you, the faculty and the staff there, for what you're doing. It was wonderful speaking with Dr. Paul Maurer at Montreat College. And I hope people will look up that college if you're thinking about going to college or you have a child who may be thinking about it. And there are a number of strong faith-based colleges, and they're bursting at the seams, and there's a reason for that. We have to make sure that we give our young people the correct foundation, and then they won't so easily fall victim to some of the things that are out stalking them in our society. And I want to thank Dr. Maurer for his insights. And thank our listeners for continuing to engage in ideals that are consistent with common sense. That's our program for this week. Make sure you listen to us for free. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Rate us, review us, tell your friends about us and your family. Spread common sense because we want it to be true, that we are a common sense nation once again. And remember the cornerstones: faith, liberty, community, and life. We'll see you next week.